So let's talk a little bit about the whole purpose of this session is what we can learn from Peoria. So how long have you been here in Dallas-Fort Worth?
4 months.
So you've been here for 4 months.
Yeah.
We've spent a lot of time with you, Cameron, myself, Marco, some other people in the community. You've spent time in Dallas as well with Trey.
Yep.
And some of the stuff that is amazing going over there, right? Bill Chen at the deck, they're doing amazing stuff. What do you feel like what do you think our competitive advantage is here in Fort Worth and then the Dallas-Fort Worth area when you evaluate our ecosystem and our ecosystem building capabilities?
I think at least from what I've seen, all the pieces are there in Fort Worth specifically, at least with the resources that are working on this stuff on a regular basis, right? The programs are there, the resources are there. It sounds like, at least from my conversations too, just the understanding and buy-in and support still needs, and I think that is always the case, right? Of continually educating people what the value is, that type of stuff. I think in the DFW area in general, every community's got their own advantages and disadvantages, Overall, I think from I don't say traditional perspective, but just looking at the overall ecosystem, like, of course, funding's always a thing that people always say. I think the early stage funding in DFW in general is non-existent.
We're not risk takers.
Yeah, it's not there.
Hey, have you heard that before? We're not risk takers.
Yep, and I think that's the case in that's the case in a lot of communities. Everybody wants to be like, I want to be like Silicon Valley, where people just throw millions of dollars at these things that are pre-revenue. Like, okay, that doesn't exist. But
well, let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of building a startup. I want to take and then we'll go back to this because I do want to go back to it. But I think this is an important topic to cover. Is that do you feel like that the entrepreneurs here in Dallas-Fort Worth truly understand how a startup gets financed?
No.
Okay.
I don't think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
At all. I think I've seen this over time and just in some interactions I've had with startups and entrepreneurs in my 4 months here. They don't even know what the business model canvas is, right? Or, some of those early stage tools and resources of what's my value proposition, what's the customer segment I'm trying to serve. Like, they have a great idea, but in a lot of cases, right, it's a great idea looking for a problem. And some of that early stage stuff, and I've done that a couple times already of walking people through, like, here's the 9 boxes of the business model canvas. Yeah. If you can't fill these out, you might not have something yet.
Right.
So to get to funding and think, I'm ready for funding, like, if you can't answer that, you've got a long ways to go to get to, to be able to be fundable. And I'm learning a lot now, just as a founder, as you mentioned, like, I've gone through, I'm doing a lot of the stuff I've been teaching people about, but when it comes to like being fundable and being ready for that, it's a new world. Like, my company I had was a services-based company, so that was a lot different than a product company. The financing's a lot different, all that kind of stuff. It's a completely different world. So, I think there's a lot of educational stuff that still needs to happen on the front end for people to understand when they're, funding ready or capital ready. And what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah, let's go back to the DFW ecosystem and kind of what you see is the strengths of it and the weaknesses.
Yeah, I think there's obviously strong industry all over the place here. Yeah. And then in just some of the research that I've been doing along with some other counterparts in the audience, there's a lot of corporate venture stuff here too. So that's actually something I talked to.
I think we have more corporate headquarters here in Dallas-Fort Worth than anywhere else. So I've talked to Bill Chen at the Deck Network and Trey and Cameron about this as well. As there was a really successful program in Illinois called the Corporate Startup Challenge, and I really think that DFW as a whole could benefit from something like that, of almost a reverse pitch type of program. For sure.
Of, hey, corporations, tell us what your issues are and your challenges are, and let's put it out to the startup community and see who can solve your problems, right? And whether that's acquisition, partnership, M&A, whatever it might be, like there's an opportunity, I think, and that's, I would say, in terms of
that's a big
strengths,
opportunity for us.
Yeah, in terms of strengths and weaknesses, I think
Yeah.
it's not a weakness, it's an opportunity of the connection between the corporates and the startup world could be way stronger, and I think there's ways to do that. It's just a programmatic thing that needs to be, figured out.
And I think there's a lot. So you talked earlier in Peoria about how you had the one failed battery startup, right? And that kind of poisoned the well for a lot of people. And I think that we've had some of those situations with corporate innovation, right? So we've had a couple of large corporations here in Dallas-Fort Worth build innovation centers, hoping that they would host startups and then buy them and commercialize their technologies. And those haven't necessarily been very successful ventures for them. And I think there's a little hesitancy around what are we really going to get out of this. And I think that maybe we need to do a little more education about a mentality shift. We were talking earlier this week about how Silicon Valley was built by one company, Fairchild Semiconductor, right? That company built Silicon Valley, and they did it with one simple decision. We don't care about our IP. They let the engineers take the IP. Not only that, they helped fund their startups, and that built Silicon Valley, right? And I don't know if there's a single corporation in town where you said, hey, let your IP go with your employees and fund their businesses and take a stake in that company. I think they would tell you you're crazy, right? We're going to use that one day. We don't know what we're going to use it for, but I promise you, we're going to use that. It's sitting on there
collecting dust on the shelf.
It has nothing to do with our business, but we're going to use that, right? So,
yeah, I think that's something we talked about in Peoria too a lot. There's an ag lab, which has tons of technology that's not being used in IP. There's Caterpillar, which has a library of that stuff. So it's to open it up, in somewhat of a controlled fashion, right?
Absolutely.
Open up the reins to that. If somebody's in a parallel or adjacent market, like with a startup, and they would benefit from it, that makes a lot of sense. And help them grow. And that's where I think like that corporate startup challenge idea of if a company comes in and lists out their problems, and the way that worked was across everything, whatever their core business was, but everything else, marketing, HR, technology, whatever, here's our problem statements. We're putting the call out. Oh, there's a company that's kind of close, but man, if they had access to that IP, they could really do something for us. So I think that's a really interesting thing that could be done here in the DFW area. So the other thing I think that's a strength is, I guess, the ecosystem building stuff, right? The support mechanisms, the education, the people that are willing to help, the programs. Like I know the DEC network has their membership perks, with free access. I'm utilizing one right now for like free Azure access account for a year. Like there's all kinds of things like that. But it becomes, I think, as entrepreneurs, right? If you're working on your thing, your head's down, working on your thing, like making sure that there's a way to get your head up and be able to look and see around, like, oh, there are people to help me with that. I don't have to go through that alone. There are resources, there's classes, all that kind of stuff. So that was the biggest thing I always saw in Peoria too, is we had to be a megaphone for some of these companies because they were busy doing their thing, and I get it. Like you get into your own thing, you're working on your stuff, and you don't have time to go toot your own horn. Right? So somebody else got to go out and do it for you. But when it comes to like, bettering or connecting with the resources, it's important for the entrepreneurs to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if we had the other big ecosystem builder up here, Trey Bowles, he always says that the power of Dallas-Fort Worth is that the people here understand, like if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm thinking about starting this, the answer is always, yeah, you should do that, right? We're not the people that are going to be like, no, there's 50 reasons why you're going to fail. We're like, yeah, you should do that, and how can I help you do that, right? I think that's a big component of ecosystem building in general.
Absolutely. And it takes certain people like yourself, myself, others that are like these super connectors, right? Of, how can I help you? And then when they ask, then you can say, oh, I know somebody that does that, or
absolutely.
I know somebody that can connect you to somebody that knows that. I think obviously in a bigger market, I didn't have that in a city or a metro area of 400,000, but in multiple millions of people, you can find somebody that can help you with a certain thing. So I went through that, and the help of somebody here in the audience of finding a database builder. That I wouldn't have known anybody to do it, but now it's ended up being this great fit and helped me with this type of thing. So I think that power of connection is super important too.
Well, let's recap a little bit, and then I want to give you some time. We might ask some questions if anybody has one, or I want to give you some time to talk about your new startup, which I think, let's face it, I mean, any true Texan is going to love your startup, right? It's definitely a Texas type startup all the way, right? But let me just recap some of the learnings and tell me if I'm off base here. I think the first great learning is that ecosystem building comes ebb and flow, right? There's ups and downs. It comes in waves, right? So things build up, they fade away, then something comes back to replace it, right? And it's always pivoting. I think that's one great lesson,
absolutely.
right? I think we see that in Dallas-Fort Worth as well, and I think it's natural. The second learning I took away from your talk is that if I'm a city official or somebody that works at the chamber or a traditional organization, it's okay for me not to understand it, right? It's okay if I don't feel like it's my world.
Right.
I can still help.
Yes.
Even though I don't understand it, it doesn't fit with what we do, there is a way for me to assist the ecosystem building without it being on my shoulders or me owning it. That's another great lesson, right? And I guess the third one is you got to find people to take over because it's a short-term gig, right? How long do you think the average ecosystem builder can last before burnout?
Well, I just found it funny. I always was in Brad Feld's book, the first startup community book. He said, give 20 years. I'm like, no.
20 months, you mean, right?
Yeah, 20 years. I don't think so. I think if it's different, if there's funding and a strong plan, like I think 5 is fair.
Yeah.
And it could be beyond that. I look at a friend of mine, Eric Engelman, who's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who's done an amazing job with NuboCo, which is an ecosystem building organization. He's still involved, but now he's moved on to manage the fund. Yeah. So then they're building a larger fund, and he did that for about five or 6 years. Got that up and running, sustainable, documented, finding succession planning. So I think 5 or 6 is a good expectation. Yeah. I don't think 20 is realistic.
Brad's a machine, man.
I guess
that guy doesn't stop. I know.
20, I don't know. Yeah. So I think 5 or 6 is good. And then if you're on that route, and I guess it just depends, right, on where you're at in your journey. Like I wanted to do my own thing and make some money. Yeah. I mean, making money and having a paycheck's always nice. So
absolutely.